So non-duality is drinking a sip of water. It's as simple as that. It's whatever's happening, and what? Drinking a sip of water is what's happening. It's whatever's arising. That's it. It's at the end of the introductory talk. It's whatever's happening, whatever's arising is everything. As we've heard so often before, it's everything and it's nothing. How can it be everything and nothing? It's just seen that it is. If non-dual seeing means anything, and I strongly suggest that it doesn't, it's a kind of ridiculous phrase, but we have to talk, so we have to use words, and words tend to break down over this. But if non-dual seeing could be said to mean anything, that's one of the ways of expressing the heart of it. There are others, but there is nothing and everything, and they are the same thing, is a way of expressing it. There is no self is another way of expressing it, and we can bring those together and we can say, when it's seen that there's no self, it's seen that there is nothing and everything arising from it. Other way round works just as well. When it's seen that there is nothing and everything arising from it, it's also seen that there is no self. It sounds different, but it's the same thing. So this is nothing, drinking nothing. This is also everything, drinking everything. So everything may go on exactly as before. It may or it may not. If this is seen, it's possible that the stuff that happens, that's the kind of everyday stuff that happens, it's possible that that might change. It might change radically, or it might not change at all. But that's in a way irrelevant, because that's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about is the transformation from seeing that, or believing, or feeling, or however we want to put it, that what's happening is happening for someone, and then the recognition that it's happening for no one. And the other way to put that, as I know that we've all heard before, is the recognition that it's just happening. There's no need for people to make stuff happen, which is just as well, because there are no people. So if stuff could only happen if there were people, there really would be no stuff happening. It seems like we're doing stuff, maybe it seems like that. For a lot of people, it seems like that. It seems like we're doing stuff, it seems like we're making stuff happen, it seems like we're in control, perhaps, of some very important things. Maybe for some of us it seems like we're in control of whole countries, and for others of us we're in control of something even more important than that, called my life. For most people, maybe it seems that I am in control of something called my life. And if that's not the case, then it may seem that I am out of control of something called my life. But nevertheless, there are still these two things. There's me and there's my life. There's me and then there's the experiences that I have. And it's quite likely that one way or the other, there is going to be the feeling, the sensation, the thought that I have influence over the experiences that I have, that I can change that in a way. Might well be the feeling that that is what life is about. That's what makes life meaningful. And indeed, for the mind, it does. Yeah. What's a meaningful life is one that I can take control of and take command of. and make things happen in, and then it all collapses. Then it may all collapse. And all of that may disappear. And it's possible that for the one who still feels very fully invested as a person, that can sound just absolutely terrible. Why would anybody want that? You know, to see that actually everything's meaningless. I mean, that just sounds like, you know, an invitation to, well, who knows what terrible thoughts and feelings for the one who's really invested in being a person. Because a lot of what being a person is about making my life meaningful. There's me and I have a life and I can make it meaningful through my free choices, my free will, the decisions that I make. And this, in a way, is at the core of most spiritual messages and most what we could call paths, the suggestion that I can do something to make my life more meaningful, more rich in different ways, more virtuous perhaps. So the suggestion to a person that that's all a kind of illusion, using that word very carefully, but none of that really has any purchase, none of that really has any reality. That suggestion to a person can sound terrible. Hence the accusation, I can't remember if it was Friday or yesterday, I think it was yesterday, I was talking about these terrible accusations of nihilism that I was getting a couple of weeks ago in London. Very easy for the person, oh, this sounds terrible, it sounds nihilistic. What a surprise then if a person does actually drop away to suddenly see that all these very important things that my life may have been based on for, 50 years, let's say, that none of them really, I want to say two things at the same time, I can't, I have to say one after the other, that none of them really existed, and none of them therefore had any importance. And it's okay. In fact, it's not nihilistic, it's a wonderful relief to suddenly see the emptiness of the person and the emptiness of the world, and that they are both the same thing, that there is no person and the world, two things, there is just oneness. And that emptiness is also, as I was saying yesterday, is also fullness. You know, it's not possible to collapse into nihilistic despair about this when it's seen that there is no person, no separate world, just emptiness. And there's also, that's not the right way to put it, not and there's also, but that emptiness is also of its nature full. And as we were saying yesterday, we can call that fullness whatever we want. The words would always be inadequate. But the words unconditional love seem to fit that fullness as well as any other phrase we could come up with. So that's what we're here this afternoon to talk about, or to sit in silence about, and it makes no difference whether there's words or whether there's silence, whether there's thought, whether there isn't, because words are just silence, vocalizing, you could say, thoughts are just silence, thinking, just as everything is nothing, manifesting itself as everything. Empty and full at the same time. I think that's enough for an introduction on a Sunday afternoon. So I'll stop there and see what happens.
What amazes me again and again is the fact maybe that on one hand the change from feeling one is a person to seeing there is no person has consequences in different ways. I mean, there are things that fall away, there is a totally different perspective and so on. And on the other hand, you and Tony and other guys that I know are talking about this are so normal. There's nothing obviously so different in how you talk, how you act, how you speak. That is amazing, I find. How is that possible? That it's such a change in one way, radical. You even mentioned that the most radical change there is. I think you said something like that.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, you cannot see any difference from outside, so to say. Everything works out well, everything is functioning, the words come on its own and are in a correct order.
Maybe.
Well, I mean, we know of other changes in the psyche where people go mad, and it's obvious then you see the person is really different.
The only thing that comes to me is that, in a way, that is what's always been happening, but it's not how it seems. So it's like there seems to be something different. If we use these terms, then let's talk about, well, just stick with sort of seeing oneness, seeing everything and nothing, right? In a story of time, up to that point, it seems like something else has been happening. It seems like, if you like, there's what we might conventionally call a person in here, choosing to do stuff, including choosing to put ideas together and speak and in control of all of that and so how can that still go on happening if the person in there collapses? But that's not how it is. It just seemed that up to that point there was someone in there doing all this stuff, but there wasn't. So it was always just happening. So why should it change?
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm amazed about. That's what I wanted to point to.
In a way, you could say, in a way, the amazing thing, you could put it the other way around. It's amazing that up to that point, there's a belief or a feeling or a sensation going on that there is someone in there who's causing it all to happen.
Yes, right. Yeah, it's the same, it's the other way of looking at it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's a bit early in the afternoon to bring in neuroscience, or maybe it isn't, I don't know. But in a way, it's like, it does become even, a little bit stranger that this assumption should be there is somebody in here working everything. That metaphor I used to use a lot, maybe I'm giving it up now because it's a bit too complicated, but like a managing director sitting behind a desk and pulling lots of levers and pressing buttons, that sensation that I'm causing all this stuff to happen. In a way, it's maybe becoming today even a little bit more weird, strange, amazing that continues for most of us, because more and more of us know on an intellectual level now. I know intellectuality doesn't count for anything in terms of what we're talking about here, but it does count for something in terms of opinions and that sort of thing. And more of us are, becoming quite aware on an intellectual level that isn't what's happening. But when this hand reaches out to pick up that glass of water, no choice has been made to do that. There's no one in here that has caused that to happen in a kind of willful sense. Neuroscience is telling us that. And yet, nevertheless, let's call it the illusion of selfhood. Oh, I like that phrase. That one's going to come up in my next talk and the one after that. The illusion of selfhood persists because it's so powerful. It's just so powerful. I know I've quoted Galen Strawson before over and over again. You know, he says, he's a philosopher. He says, I know perfectly well that there's no such thing as free will, but I can't feel that in my everyday life. And I suppose that's why the illusion continues to persist so strongly. Doesn't matter how many books, popular works on neuroscience we've read, for most of us, when that happens, there's the feeling, of course there's something in here that's decided to do that. And that something is me, that is the essential me. What could be more the essential me than the part of myself that has control and choice over my life? I mean, maybe I could accept that everything else is contingent, that's not really the essential me, but when it comes to the things that I have control over, that really is, that's the essential me. When the essential me is really there when I'm in the ballot box voting in the European elections in Germany on Sunday today. That's the real me. You know, I have this autonomous and possibly God-given right to vote for, I don't know the names of the parties, but you get the point. You see. It's very, very strong illusion. It is an illusion, or appearance, it's very strong. So that's, sorry, kind of lost track of the initial point you were making, except to say, it's, the astonishing thing we could say is exactly the other way around. It's astonishing that we continue with this illusion that there is someone in here who is in control of things, as there emerges more and more evidence that there isn't. But that evidence can easily be ignored. I mean, it is fairly easy not to go out to a bookshop and buy a book on the new neuroscience. Quite easy to ignore it. But what we're talking about here, direct seeing, well, if that happens, then it's kind of game over. And that's why it's often reported as such a shock. Particularly if it comes out of the blue for an individual who's had no interest in what we're talking about today, and just had no exposure to it. That could be a real shock, of course. But to be honest, even if we have had an interest in it, maybe we've been going to talks and reading books about it for years, it's still a real shock, because nothing that the mind does over this can possibly prepare for even a split second of seeing. And the reason for that is because everything up to that point that has been experienced consciously has been experienced from the perspective of a separate person. So of course there can't be any apprehension of what it's like when that's not there, because it's always been there.
Yeah.
It's not a good analogy, but nevertheless, even if there is such a thing as kind of absolute total colour blindness in the sense of, everything is just seen in shades of black and white and grey. But imagine if there is, there may be, I don't know, such a state. But then if there is, and then suddenly the world turns into colour, that would be a shock. And nothing like the shock we're talking about here. Because at least the world experienced in colour and the world experienced in black and white would still have that connection of being experienced apparently by a person. But to see this is all happening without any intervention on my part, because there isn't a me. It's not without any intervention on my part, end of sentence, that's not it. There isn't any intervention on my part because there is no me who can make an intervention. And that's the most radical shift in seeing there can be. Yeah. And I've gone on long enough to completely lose track of the original point.
It's all about this. Seems to be connected. For example, you said why questions are anyway. You can't answer them, you have to come with a story. And yet, the fact that it seems also logical what happens, that the language works out well, that the brain works out, and that seems to be all kind of set up by an intelligence or whatever.
Yeah.
Because it could also be total chaos, everything.
Yeah.
If there's all and nothing, that could mean there's just an immense chaos of impressions,
Yeah.
and no meaning in that sense.
Yeah. I'd just take one little word out of what you said there, and I'd just go along with everything else, which is "and." You said "and intelligence." Just take the word "and" out of it, and just talk about obvious characteristics of apparent reality. Clearly there's order, clearly there's intelligence. I mean, not kind of like separate, as it were, but I mean just like if we want to talk, if we're going to talk in terms of characteristics, in a way we have to if we're going to talk at all. I mean, I talk in terms of everything and nothing, silence and noise, stillness and movement. Those are all characteristics. We could say, well, in a way it's a nonsense to talk about them, but in another way it isn't. They kind of make sense to the mind.
Mm-hmm.
So talking in terms of, so there's silence, there's clearly there's order, clearly there is order, everything is not chaotic, clearly there's intelligence. Now, you know, you might want to pin us down a bit and say, well, what do you mean by that? And we might grub around finding it quite difficult to actually specify what we mean by that. I'm going to stick with clearly there is intelligence. Now, what the mind will tend to do with that, because the mind personifies everything, is actually say, no, I'm not happy with clearly there's intelligence. That sounds really kind of a bit loopy to me. Are you saying that that chair is intelligent? No, I'm not saying that. You know? So it's more likely that the mind will actually say, clearly there is an intelligence. And then it's only it's not a leap from that, it's only a very tiny step from that to say, clearly there's a guiding intelligence. There's order, clearly there must be someone or something ordering it. And we've then gone very, very easily and very quickly, you know, into creating a story which, you know, we know where that will lead in any culture, you know, to the idea of some kind of, might be a creator God or some kind of supreme being or something like that. I mean, it's kind of very logical for the mind to follow that path. And after all, if, you know, the mind experiences everything from, let's call it, the position of separation, not without consciously realising it maybe, but nevertheless that's the experience. So it's going to be perfectly natural for the mind, if it starts thinking in terms of higher intelligence, then to imagine that in terms of, you know, sort of some kind of separate being or whatever. It's all very natural. Again, this can be why this is partly why it can be such a shock if that just drops away. It's not just my being dropping away, it's God's being dropping away in a way. It's not just seeing through, not just seeing through, I'm going to use the word illusion, not just seeing through the illusion of my personhood, but it's also seeing through the illusion of God's godhood. It's just, well, it's all one. There's no room for beings in that sense. There's no room for my being, there's also no room for archangels.
Mm. Mm.
Or transcendent Buddhas to whom I can hopefully pray for intervention.
The work that someone does, like the scientist, let's say, or psychotherapist, without any personality, without any I, he could go on.
Yeah, of course.
Go on.
And it wouldn't be without any personality. That's different.
Yeah, okay.
Because we started this with you talking about how things, stay the same. That's the personality. They may or they may not. The personality could also change somewhat. It's quite possible, or the character. But the personality is the personality. It's a set of characteristics, if you like, the personality, which seems to belong to somebody, but actually is just a set of characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, yeah, of course. You can go on. Yeah. I've even met somebody who managed to go on being an Episcopalian minister after seeing this.
Yeah.
Didn't make sense to me, but it made sense to them. So, well, why not? It's fine. Nothing wrong with that.
So let's say as a scientist, there would be still ideas about how things are connected and what are the laws of so gravity and or whatever.
But not just for the scientists, for everyone, because if all those ideas about how things are connected fell apart, then there would genuinely be chaos, and there couldn't be even the remotest possibility of leading a normal life, because if all ideas about connectivity fall away, then this, whether this is regarded as an I or not, cannot go outside, wait at the bus stop, catch a bus, go into town and do the shopping, because all of that depends on the kind of expectation of connectivity. But yes, of course, you can't do science without, science is all about, looking for cause and effect, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, that all goes on working in the same way that, the body, mind, whatever you want to call it. I do still like Nathan's phrase, the divine puppet. In the same way that the divine puppet will get up in the morning probably and put its clothes on before it goes outside. And if it doesn't, it will get arrested. I don't quote Moody very often, I can assure you, but I also maybe he wasn't the first to say this, but, it's where I kind of picked it up from a video or something, or somebody quoting it, that that lovely question I got asked it quite early on. It's in one of my early books. So what you're saying is I can go and murder people on the streets. This kind of. It's very easy for the mind to misunderstand what's being said here. Yeah. But this thing, somebody said to Moody, so it doesn't matter if I go and murder somebody in the street. Well, in a way, of course, the answer to that is it doesn't matter. In a way, that is the answer, but it's not the complete answer. It's not the answer that Moody gave. The answer that he gave. Well, it doesn't matter as long as because this is a dream. People say so. Nothing really matters, does it? So it doesn't matter if I murder somebody in the street in this dream. To which the answer is, well, it doesn't matter as long as you don't mind being hunted down by the dream police, hauled in front of a dream judge and put into a dream prison. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, to put that much more simply and without bringing in these kind of melodramatic ideas of murdering people in the street, life goes on unless seeing this happens at the same time as a fatal heart attack, which I'm sure it does sometimes, but unless that happens, life goes on, an ordinary, on that kind of everyday level, the divine puppets, the character, whatever you want to call it, the mind-body organism continues to function and continues to be subject to exactly the same laws of both physics and laws of humanity as happened before. So yeah, why shouldn't the biochemist who's seen this go on looking for a cure for cancer? Of course. There is a long tradition, well, there are many long traditions of individuals going off and living a special kind of life when this is seen. So I think this feeds into the stories of the specialness.
The mystic.
The mystics, the monks, the ascetics, the sannyasin. Yeah. going off and living in a special life both in search of this, but then even more so living a special life when this has been found, whatever that means. Yeah, living atop a mountaintop kind of thing, yeah. Wearing special clothes, eating special food, receiving special kinds of love from special kinds of devotees. So that kind of feeds into the stories about how, I think, not for all minds obviously, probably not even for the majority of minds, but for minds that become interested in what we're talking about, nothing can seem more special than what we're talking about. And yet, isn't it wonderful that this is so full of paradox, and Zen gets that borrowed paradox so well. Nothing can seem more special than what we're talking about, but in actuality nothing is more ordinary than what we're talking about. This is a clumsy phrase for me to use, but I'd use it, the world, reality seen in this way is in a way far more ordinary than reality appears to the person with all the filters. Those filters make reality seem so much more complicated than it really is. Doesn't get much simpler than this is all there is. What do you mean by all there is? Whatever's happening. That red bus that just went past. Is it? Doesn't get much simpler than that. I started off, but this is it, this is non-duality. King's water, that's it. Doesn't seem very special.
It's almost like always trying to figure out what is the mechanism of this eye. That if you could figure it out, you could stop it. And yet that's the eye itself constantly trying to figure it out when it can't, because it is it. And there's always an advantage seems to be advantage always over there for those who can say how simple it is. Then if it's so simple, then why can't I see it?
If it's so simple, why doesn't this, in the story of time, why didn't this body-mind organism, why didn't this body-mind organism see it for so many decades? It was that simple. I know. It's
a contradiction as well. Well, not
seems
really.
to be. Well, we can only answer that question really with metaphors, and we could say, well, because there's something in the way. And it's natural for the one who feels separate to feel they can do something to clear that something in the way, out of the way. When they can't.
No.
But they can have a lot of fun trying.
It's not fun.
Trying some meditation and gurus and foreign travel and great fun.
When I ask myself, what is it that is afraid of death, of dying? That's me. And me tries to find all kinds of ways to avoid the idea even, or avoid the fear of death. And that is, for me here, the most amazing thing, that it seems that when it falls away, that it seems there is nothing that can die. Because it's anyways always empty. So what should be afraid?
I always make a careful distinction between the fear of death and the fear of dying, which are very different things, because dying is an event which happens in an apparent life, and death isn't an event which happens in an apparent life. But yeah, essentially.
Dying, you mean the process of,
exactly.
with maybe pain and
exactly.
things like that. Okay.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, that is, I think that is a pretty strong, I mean, anything can happen, but I think probably a pretty strong tendency that concerns about death will either radically reduce or die away when this is seen, yeah.
Would you say that the energetic Kundalini experiences have improved your quality of life?
Do I think they've improved the quality of my life? It's an interesting question. I think because of the circumstances in which we're in, this is an afternoon about non-duality. I mean, I'm thinking about it, and I've probably come up with an answer, but I feel like it has the same bearing on what we're talking about here, let's say, as if I'd been training to run a marathon, for example, and somebody had said, well, do you feel that like running 8 kilometres a day every day has improved the quality of your life? It's on that kind of level, I would take it. It's like, it's part of the stuff that happens. I wouldn't necessarily make it any particularly special, any more than any other part of the stuff that happens, the stuff that goes on, the experiences that happen. And now I've lost, because my memory is so poor, now I've lost touch with the exact question. Has it improved?
The quality.
So on that everyday level. And the reason I've gone blank, I think, is because I probably don't know the answer to that question.
Is it fun, at least?
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yeah, it's fun. Yeah. It's interesting. So on that level, yeah. Again, maybe like going to see a good movie, in a way, yeah.
Cheaper.
But
I know Netflix is pretty cheap.
That's true. Perhaps the question goes about the body, not about the personal life, but about the body-mind organism.
Yeah.
And it changes something in the body-mind organism.
Yes, maybe.
So, yeah.
It's considered to, isn't it? I mean, if we look, I don't know very much about this, to be honest, which might already be obvious from my answer up to now, but it certainly is, that's kind of part of the sort of the tradition in the literature, in the philosophy, if we call it that, that somehow it's, I suppose the obvious word is purifying.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I mean, there's so many of these.
Mm-hmm.
In the same way that, so that, there's a lot of, I know it's different, but there's a lot of kind of like religious stories about things we can do which will be purifying in different ways. Is that right? I don't know. On that level of, as you say, the body-mind organism, maybe. I mean, I've certainly heard stories of characters who've had ongoing Kundalini, very powerful Kundalini experiences, and the quality of their life doesn't seem to have improved one little bit. In fact, in some ways it's got worse. I mean, I'm not in any way an expert at all, but I've just sort of picked up a little bit here and there of kind of cases, people who've written books and given them accounts. So I think it's highly unpredictable.
I just think it will change the chemistry, like hormones or neurotransmitters or something like that.
What was that last phrase, which I suspect sounded like?
It's neurotransmitter.
Neurotransmitters?
Yeah, maybe it's changed the chemistry in the brain or something like that.
I think that's absolutely highly likely. It seems to me that it's probable. Again, it's pretty obvious. I'm not a neuroscientist, but never, it's pretty likely that anything which could be considered to be an experience has a parallel, a concomitant, something happening in the brain. It seems to be becoming apparent that there is nothing that can be experienced without it having some kind of basis in brain function. So I'd agree with you there, yeah. And maybe, with the new neuroscience, we may make big advances in our understanding of things like Kundalini experience.
Yeah. And so I meant if you perceive a difference in the body, maybe you can better move, or
in the same way if you take exercise. In the same way. I mean, I do Tai Chi, and as you can see from my live and beautiful body, The difference with Kundalini experiences is that from the ordinary perspective, if you know what I mean by that, then we're talking about something which is apparently spontaneous, whereas with somebody practicing Tai Chi, we're not. But from the perspective that I'm talking here, actually they're both equally spontaneous. It may seem like, if I both do Tai Chi and experience Kundalini phenomena, it seems like I'm choosing the first. I've gone all poetic now, I'm going to say that it seems like the second has chosen me. But no, actually they're both just stuff happening. Just gets up on a Wednesday morning and goes and does Tai Chi. There's no person behind that. So in a way you could say they're equally spontaneous. Interesting phenomenon, It's obvious that we can build a very big story on them, a very big story of spiritual nature. That's all right, that's fine. Or try your Kundalini experiences on a Calvinist or Lutheran minister of the church and see what they say about them. They'll be able to build probably a very different story about them.
You're obsessed of the
Exactly, possessed. Yeah, and there's other kind of experiences in the same ballpark, like out-of-body experiences, near-death experiences and so forth. Probably, as neuroscience advances, we'll understand more what's happening in the brain when this happens. It's interesting. It's interesting if we find it interesting, and I do. But have I mentioned it before? If you've got Netflix, there's this most wonderful documentary called Holy Hell.
Holy hell.
Yeah, have I mentioned that before?
Oh, I'd like to see that. We might
watch
not
it.
get it here, though. They have different ones in different countries.
Really?
Yeah, depending on what country you're in, you get different offerings. It's called Holy Hell.
It's called Holy Hell. There's a wonderful series of documentaries about Osho in America
Oh, that's the
called
one.
Wild Country.
That.
You've seen that one?
Wild Country, yeah.
Very long. Well,
Yeah.
Holy Hell is just one, maybe an hour and a half documentary about a very strange guru figure I'd never heard of. He's a ballet dancer, actually. He's passionate about ballet, so one of his spiritual practices, all his devotees have to do ballet as a spiritual practice. Hours on end, day after day. This very strange, plausible young man who walks around in Speedo swimming trunks all the time and has this absolutely adoring following. And he seems to have the ability to transmit some kind of, going back to Kundalini, he seems to have some ability to transmit some kind of, transformative energy in some way. So he's got people really hooked. I don't want to spoil it by telling you too much of the story. I just want to leave it there. The Speedo wearing young guru.
I guess you've got to be young to be around him, otherwise by the time you're...
I really highly recommend. I mean, the two, apart from the documentaries on Osho, the two ones I would really recommend. That one called Holy Hell, and then there's one I've mentioned before called Kumare, which you can buy, but it's very cheap. I don't think you can watch it for free, but it's very cheap. You can download it from iTunes or something like that. It's wonderful.
What's it called?
Kumare.
Kumare.
Kumare. It's about a young, it's made by it about a young, he's Indian, but he was born in America, Indian extraction, and he decides, he goes on a kind of pilgrimage to India to see if there's anything in the tradition he's been taught about by his grandmother as he's growing up. You know, he's grown up with puja and incense and chanting, and he does a tour of India to various gurus to see if he thinks there's anything in it. He decides there isn't. And he comes back and he basically performs this experiment. He turns himself into a guru, grows his hair long, grows his beard, adopts a kind of fake Indian accent that he's learnt off his grandmother, and just appears one day with two very beautiful helpers, which helps, in this American town. I can't remember if it may have been Phoenix or Tucson, somewhere maybe in Arizona, just appears out in the desert in guru costume, and just sets himself up as a guru. His first meeting, I think he gets one person to, and then after a while he's got this group of followers, and it's an extraordinary documentary. Yeah, it's an absolute must-see. He's working up to the point where he is going to deliberately reveal himself to be a fake. You know, I won't tell you what happens, but
They kill him.
well, there's a whole mix of reactions, as you might expect, you know, from people who've absolutely devoted themselves to him. Yeah. But yes, it's a very entertaining circus, isn't it, the guru thing? But it's far better than a circus if we're sustained by belief. It's just this, you know, it must be a bit like religious conversion. You know, nothing better than feeling like, you know, I have found a higher truth and now I'm part of it. Wonderful. Until it falls apart. I think of all those ministers and bishops and cardinals and vicars who lost their faith 30 years ago, but they don't know anything else they can do. They can't, you know, they can't become doctors when they're 50. They have to go on Sunday after Sunday, climbing into the pulpit and giving empty sermons they no longer believe in.
Everybody's fate is a lie. Well, I have to say, a lot of my work and what I do is do as if it's true. Sort of putting on the show, so to say, or to be able to get up and go and do things. Sometimes it just really requires a kind of, okay, this is the act, go for it.
Yeah.
It's the stage, and you go on and you play it, and sometimes you get lost in it, and it's fun, it's good.
Yeah.
But it's certainly, yeah.
I mean, that's another good metaphor, isn't it, for what we're talking about here, is, you know, it's a play.
Yeah.
We are actors in a play, and sometimes the actors are so good they get carried away, and, you know, the actor playing Hamlet really believes for a while that he's Hamlet, and maybe that's how he gives the best performance.
Absolutely.
And some of us are Hamlets, and some of us are Ophelius, and some of us are third spear carrier, but, you know, we can all get carried away, and, you know, I can really believe I am the third spear carrier. It's not a great analogy, it's not a bad one, and then there's suddenly, oh no, I'm just an actor.
But would you not also say that there is some strong tendency to keep the experience going on? experiencing should go on and on and on. Meaning that's not, you don't want to die.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe in the brain something.
Yeah, I'd say it is, and not only say that's evolutionary, I'd say it's an evolutionary necessity. You know, we're going to talk about, you know, the monkey machine on that ordinary level where we want it to go on. Yeah, I'd say it's an evolutionary necessity, because if that wasn't there, we wouldn't be here. You know, it seems kind of fairly obvious. There are certain evolutionary, I can't think of the word I want, so I'll stick with necessity, you know, without which there would be, you know, that species simply wouldn't exist on that level. So yeah, that's quite natural. And it's also quite natural, I think, that evolutionary imperative should be overridden in certain individual cases by other feelings. You know, so it doesn't go on for everyone. You know, in other words, some individuals commit suicide. But yeah, it's part of how this stuff works. Yeah. Sexual attraction, preference for being alive rather than for being dead. These things, without that, there wouldn't be. It's just part of evolutionary reality. I'd say the same thing about our peculiar mixture of character, if you like, this strange mixture we have between, you know, aggression and empathy. You know. Probably without one or the other, we wouldn't be so successful from that point of view. Can you imagine if we just had the aggression without the empathy? Well, we might have been fairly successful, but only in very small bands. You know, like gorillas. Well, no, gorillas, that's a bad example, because they're not very aggressive. But like chimpanzees are very aggressive.
Yeah.
You know, and then, you know, if we'd had all the empathy but none of the aggression, we probably wouldn't have been very successful either. We'd still be sitting around in caves saying, "How do you feel?" I know the hunt didn't go very well this afternoon. You know, we lost Wilbur to a mastodon. How does that feel? Would anybody like to say anything about how they feel about Wilbur being eaten by the mastodon? So we wouldn't have been very successful as a species that way either. You know. Cooperation and competition, that's it, isn't it? It's the balance between those two things that makes us so incredibly successful.
I was wondering what you think about gurus who sleep with their devotees. And I was just curious because I came across a number of people recently who were very, very, very angry about that, you know, like just, you know, almost taking it personally somehow. But
yes.
So, do you have an opinion?
I may do. I'm not sure if I do have an opinion. I don't think I know what it is. I have an opinion about that last thing about people who aren't involved personally, if you like. You know, getting on what we call, say in English, getting on their high horse about it. I mean, I think that goes with a kind of mind story about morality and goodness and spirituality having to do with morality and goodness. And then I don't know if you have the same distinction in German that in English. There's quite a big distinction between morality and moralistic. You know, so I mean, morality is a kind of neutral word, just describing different kinds of behaviour. But moralistic is that thing of kind of, you know, this is very wrong and I condemn you for it. So yeah, there is a kind of part of me that's sort of rather tolerant and I don't know if it is an English word, but we use it in English, a bit loose, you know. I have rather loose attitudes which would probably be condemned by Puritan society. And I think, well, you know, if when something doesn't directly involve you like that, but you get very moralistic about it, then that is probably just saying something about your own character. And I want to say your own fucked upness, but it would be very bad for me to say that, so I won't say it, particularly with actually 2 cameras pointing at me. Yeah, I've lost track of what you said now. Was the question really about other people's attitudes and responses to the Guru's behaviour, or was it about, do I have an attitude to the Guru's behaviour?
I was interested in
I don't really have an attitude to it, no.
I don't think so, but I was just because I think Rick Archer, some in the back gap interviews was it seems to come up again and again, this idea of creating this ethics for, you know, board of ethics for spiritual teachers.
Would you like to say a bit more about that, because I've heard about this and I do think this is quite interesting. Do you want to say enough to kind of explain it, as it were, this thing that Rick Archer and a few other people seem to be trying to set up?
Well, I'm not sure when he was talking to Jack O'Keefe and Craig Holliday and a couple others about it, and there seemed to be a lot of people he interviewed feeling very strongly about this, and for some reason in me it terrifies me. I just think
But say a bit more about, they want to, let me try this and you tell me if I've got this right or wrong. But my understanding is there are a group of people who want to set up a kind of I don't know, an organisation or an ethics committee.
Something like that,
to which spiritual teachers and gurus should belong and should be accountable and should have a code of ethics to follow, very much on the model of the kind of organisations and codes of ethics that psychotherapists have to follow. Is that correct?
Something like that,
It just absolutely fills me with, I don't know whether the mixture, well, it fills me with a mixture of horror and despair, and I don't know whether horror or despair is uppermost. I just, every fibre of my body just says, get your noses out of other people's business. And it's not, it's not the topic of the afternoon that we should be talking about psychotherapy and psychotherapy organisations and accreditations and governing bodies and so forth, but I've watched it happen over the last decade. It just seems to me that all of this stuff has just sucked the lifeblood out of psychotherapy and has turned it from an incredibly vibrant, creative, wonderful, freeing force into a kind of grey, horrible sort of, I just can't bear this kind of impulse to make, in making it safe, we render it useless. And I would say, I know I could be considered as completely irresponsible for saying this, but I just think that, we have an English phrase, I don't know if you have the exact equivalent in German, that the cure is worse than the disease. And if ever there was a case of the cure being worse than the disease, it seems to me it's what's happened to psychotherapy. We've sucked the creativity out and replaced it with this kind of the moral Puritan police. And I think if that were to happen, I can't see that it could possibly happen in the field of the spiritual teacher, the guru and so forth, but if it did, I think he would do the same thing. It's a fairly forthright answer, and probably a totally irresponsible one.
It's weird, there's something like that, Andrew Cohen and the whole, what's the other guy who's into this, all his theories that they Ken Wilber, do you know these guys?
But do I know them? I've got an incredibly long chapter in my new book about, partly about Ken Wilber and Andrew Cohen.
I don't know, these people that...
No, it's not the same thing.
No, I know.
But so what
I know, but I mean, but it's in the same direction, isn't it? Where they're trying to make a committee to watch over the...
Oh, it seems more than likely to me, yes.
Yeah, but I don't know these people that Alan mentioned. Are they psychotherapists or are they spiritual people?
No, they're...
They're spiritual people.
Teachers?
Spiritual teachers.
Spiritual teachers and so. That's why I brought in psychotherapy. It seems to me they're wanting to do the same thing for, let's call it, the spiritual world loosely, as has happened to the psychotherapeutic world over the last three decades. Yeah, I didn't know Ken Wilber and Andy Coe were involved in that. It does not surprise me one bit, and my blood freezes at the thought.
Well, he says they should be the leaders too. I mean, they're self-proclaimed people that think they know the
Can I just shut the window? So this is so important what we're discussing. I just want to shut the little barky dog out. It's not important, but it's interesting. I'm interested. I should own this. I am interested. Can you say that last bit again?
Yeah, it's the same with, we've talked about that as well, that it's like that these people are self-proclaimed.
Yeah.
Like, who gave them the right to be the heads of this committee to begin with? Like, why are they the ones to make the decisions? Or, I mean, there's endless questions you can ask around it.
Yeah, it seems to me also that Puritanism is almost invariably far more dangerous than whatever the thing is that the Puritans set up themselves against. And then another thing, I think it's the same kind of reason why, one of the problems with ashrams is they tend to end up being run by the psychopaths. And there's a kind of like a cosmic law about that. Why should that happen? Well, it's because the psychopaths want to run them, that's why. It's kind of, it's fairly obvious. And I think it's a little bit the same, but with what we're talking about, I think they tend to be, the people in control tend to be not the psychopaths, but the bureaucrats. Why? Because it's the bureaucrats who want to set up and run these organisations. It's like blood to a vampire, isn't it? A committee, 3 subcommittees and 5 sub-subcommittees, they are like blood to a vampire for a bureaucrat. So the ashrams end up being run by the psychopaths, and the psychotherapy and spiritual accrediting organisations end up being run by bureaucrats, and it's just all horrible and grey, and let's hope it doesn't happen.
I mean, I guess you don't have to follow it. You can ignore all those things.
Well, until it becomes law. Until it becomes law. I mean, you can't. I mean, if you're a psychotherapist, my understanding, and I might be wrong. If you're a psychotherapist in Germany, you can't.
Yeah.
You can try and ignore it still in.
No, but I'm talking about these spiritual teachers here.
Yeah, we'll see until they pass a law. I mean, again, I'm going out of my comfort zone with knowledge and information here, but I believe, this may not still be the case, it may be, but I believe that some years ago, at least Reiki was illegal in Spain. You could go to prison for practicing Reiki in Spain.
Something is
now, if I'm wrong, then if this video goes public, by all means email me and tell me I'm wrong, but
different kinds of healing, for example, the word even healing, heilen, was with laws around it somehow. You couldn't just call yourself a healer.
Where?
In
Germany. Yeah.
When?
I think it's still
yes, that's my understanding. But these self-appointed guardians of morality that you were talking about, it just makes my blood freeze. Oh no, please. There is an incident in. I hope I'm not seen as sitting here trying to sort of endlessly plug the new book. It's just that things from it come into my head which seem to be relevant. There's an incident in that book from quite a long time ago when a Buddhist teacher you got quite angry with me because Sogyal Rinpoche, Lama Sogyal Rinpoche, who ran Rigpa, he's now in a lot of trouble and a lot of scandal, but back then he wasn't. He was considered very pure, and then there was the first scandal. And this Buddhist teacher I knew was a follower of Rigpa and a follower of his, and she was outraged by this and just obviously expected me to be equally outraged, and I wasn't. I don't know, maybe I should have been, but it just seemed like, well, firstly, he's not a monk, so he hasn't taken vows of celibacy, I presume, so, nothing hypocritical going on there, and then the woman involved was an adult. So, but it caused quite a frisson as we say in Paris, it caused a bit of upset between us, because this Buddhist just absolutely felt I should share her moral outrage at this. Well, no.
Well, we talked about, or you said that this is not in time. This is not in time. It's not any time that you can measure. So if there's no time, there's also nothing that can happen in this, or this is not happening.
And yet something appears to be happening. I know, it's impossible. It's impossible, and we have to fish around for special language to try to describe it, and of course the language fails, but I think that's probably why the word appearance is so often used by myself and by others when talking about this, because clearly something appears to be happening. That's obvious. So anyone that sits in the front of a room like this, or in a coffee bar writing books indeed, you know, and so, well, there's nothing happening, which leaves it at that. Does sound a bit ridiculous, doesn't it? It's like, it's ironic, you know, everything's dualistic, everything is dualistic. We're here talking about non-duality, and yet we have to use language and concepts which must sound dualistic. They have to. And so here we seem to be saying two different things which may or may not be conceived of by the mind as contradictory. There is nothing happening. There's nothing happening. And there is the appearance of something happening. And it's even worse than that, because of course, as I'm sure you've all come across many times before, that phrase, there's nothing happening, is maybe deliberately, on the part of the speaker, maybe not deliberately, ambiguous, because it can mean two different things. You know, there's nothing happening, or there's nothing happening. This is nothing happening. You know?
Oh, that's good.
That's not the first time you've come across that, is it?
But now it sinks in.
Right, okay, yeah. This is nothing manifesting as everything, so this is nothing happening.
Yeah. I'm not the fastest.
And the, whatever you want to call this, the divine puppet, the monkey machine, you know, the psychophysical organism, whatever you want to call it, lives in time, which does not exist, and yet this lives in time. And the obvious analogy again, the most obvious analogy is the nighttime dream. Because in a nighttime dream, it is quite obvious for the one in the nighttime dream that there is time. The one in the nighttime dream might dream of making a journey by train from this city to that city. That, and all sorts of events may happen in that journey, and that journey can only unfold in time. It can't unfold in nothing, it must be unfolding in time. Yet the moment that we wake up from the nighttime dream, it's seen that that time didn't exist. We can call it an appearance, we can call it imaginary if we want to, but it didn't exist. Neither did the space that existed in the dream. That didn't exist either. I was talking about Leo Harting's book either yesterday or the day before, Awakening to the Dream. It's just, you know, such a good analogy. And the analogy of a film is equally good, and I remain convinced that if the ancient seers of India 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago had a 10-screen Odeon that they could have gone to on a Tuesday matinee for a few rupees, then they would definitely have used the analogy of a cinema film for this, because it's such a good analogy. It's the same thing, isn't it? You know, on a cinema screen, all sorts of things seem to be happening. There seems to be time in which the story unfolds. There seems to be space through which the hero moves. There seem to be emotions which have the utmost reality in the characters on the screen, so real for the characters on the screen that they invoke real emotions in the audience. And yet we know it's just a play of light. Muthalanda's autobiography was called Play of Light. I doubt whether that was based on his experiences of the 10-screen Odeon in the jungle where he did his spiritual seeking. But, it's a play of light, isn't it? It's a very good, natural kind of traditional metaphor for this. A play of light. It's a play of light. It's also a very good way of describing what happens on the cinema screen. I mean, all life is up there on the cinema screen. If it's a good film and we're kind of open to it as an experience, all life is really up there, yet we know it's just a play of light. There's no people, no emotions, no hero, no journey, no time. Well, there is, you could say there's the time that we spend in the cinema, but there certainly isn't the 30 years that takes place on the cinema screen. But it can be heart-wrenching, can't it? So that's a very good analogy for what we're talking about here. It seems so real on the cinema screen. It seems so real. It really does seem as if the hero suffers. If it's a good film. Mm-hmm. And another part of the analogy that might work is it seems three-dimensional. On the cinema screen, no, it's not. You go up to the screen, you can see it's just a flat screen, two-dimensional screen. It seems so three-dimensional. Yeah, this is one of the kind of perceptions. I mean, it doesn't matter. It's one of the characteristic perceptions that's sometimes described as there's an awakening to this. That it's like the three-dimensional life that's there seems to become two-dimensional. I think we were talking about this a little bit on Friday evening. So what seems so solid and three-dimensional can start to seem sort of so translucent and two-dimensional as if it's just hanging on the thinnest of thin gauze screens in front of us. And that's exactly what's happening at the cinema.
And this idea of being an I, is that like in the analogy, if I identify with the main character in the movie, something like that, I feel with him, he's crying and I also feel sad and...
Yeah, so you're kind of sucked into the illusion that there is a real I on the screen, you know. My trick question was always, you know, in Casablanca when Ingrid Bergman, was it? When the Ingrid Bergman character fails to turn up at the railway station in Paris to catch the last train out of occupied France with Rick. That broken look of despair on Humphrey Bogart's face as he gets on the train finally because it's all he can do. And the trick question is, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much does Rick suffer when Ingrid Bergman doesn't turn up to flee Paris or free France with him? Well, obviously it's a trick question. There is no suffering. He's not real. You know? There is no Rick. There appears to be a Rick, and Rick appears to suffer, but there is no Rick. Now, that's not a perfect analogy for what we're talking about here, but it's quite a good one. There's no Richard, there's no Christian, there's no Dawn, there's no Patrick. There's no Horst. But there's a very convincing appearance. And if you have a particular kind of romantic nature like I have, and you're watching Casablanca, that too is a very convincing appearance.
Do you find a lot of people have awakenings in your meetings? And reading your books?
Usually happens 23 minutes after they've left the meeting. That's a leading question. I think it's meaningless, it's meaningless phenomenon. I get communications from people sometimes. I don't know, something about that first book maybe, perhaps because it's very quiet, so very short, so people don't give. I get communications sometimes from people who say, I was reading your book or watching a video and, something happened. Yeah, it can happen. Of course, anything can happen. Yeah, sitting on a bus, buying fish and chips, even listening to a talk about non-duality. Yeah. That's a hook, isn't it? That's a nice hook.
What about all the awakenings through suicide attempts, failed suicide attempts?
Say that again, what
There's
about?
a lot of people reported, it's been studied, who have awakening experiences.
Yeah.
And a failed suicide attempt. I think Steve Taylor did it.
Right, okay, yeah. And other extreme circumstances as well. And yeah, indeed, if we want to develop a method out of that, let's go ahead. Yeah. Clearly, clearly that can happen. Clearly, extreme situations, all kinds of extremes. It's the same thing with sort of, accident, car accidents, that sort of thing. Actually, there's a little warning here just come into my mind that I'll try and remember to come back to. But clearly, very extreme situations like car accidents and so forth can, So again, if you want to ascribe cause and effect there, then be my guest. I mean, this is probably the best country, one of the best. Well, it's probably the only. It probably is the best country in Western Europe to go down that path because you don't have speed limits on your autobahns, do you? So if you want to try to provoke an awakening experience through a car accident, but yeah, there is clearly for some. Using this very romantic phrase, for some psychophysical organisms, that can happen. In the story, that can happen. There can be a very extreme, apparently life-threatening event, and there can be an awakening. Without a doubt, that can happen. However, I'd also give a warning. It's not the obvious warning that putting yourself into a very dangerous, life-threatening situation is obviously not a guaranteed way of producing an awakening. But the other thing is that I've talked to, this is such a difficult thing to talk about because language is so inadequate, and I've talked to, a few, not many, but I've talked to a few people, individuals, who, their account is they've had awakenings through exactly the sort of thing, car accidents, etc. And as I'm talking to them, I just know we're talking about different things. We're not talking about the same thing. And it's very difficult sometimes to pin down through language what somebody really means. But, I mean, I'm thinking of one person, one case in particular, but there are others as well, coming to me, I'm thinking, no, you're talking about an out-of-body experience. That's not the same.
Yes.
This is not an out-of-body experience, and it's seen that there's no one, nothing, and there's just oneness, In body or out of body just becomes irrelevant. There's no such thing as in body or out of body at that point. So I think, we well, we don't need to be cautious because it doesn't matter, who cares in a way. But if we want to kind of carry out a kind of intellectual investigation, just for the sake of it, because we're interested, a kind of connections, possible connections between what we're talking about and very extreme circumstances, that sort of thing. You can't assume people are talking about the same thing because they're using the same language. I think out of body experiences interesting. I don't think they've got anything to do with what we're talking about.
No.
Yeah,
I had an out-of-body experience in a
Go on,
accident.
Yeah?
It was very clear out-of-body experience because I could see what there is happening.
Yeah.
And it's very clear, it's nothing spiritual.
Yeah.
It's nothing to do with spiritual.
So you wouldn't connect it with what we're talking about?
No.
I mean,
No.
it's
a phenomenon.
It's a phenomenon, exactly, yeah. If I think back to, I don't know, I think when I was about 10, I'd say I sort of fairly, I can't remember how often, fairly often had out-of-body experiences, lying in bed, as many children do, where the awareness expands or the point of awareness is somewhere other than the physical body.
Yeah.
It's very common, that. I wouldn't make any connection between that and what we're talking about. No. I think in some out-of-body experiences, having talked to a few people about this, there can be other experiences like of otherworldly beings. Notice the air quotations for the camera. Otherworldly beings, that sort of thing. And I think maybe then, depending on the kind of stories the person's absorbed about spirituality or awakening, then there can be, oh yeah, this is awakening, but no, I don't. There's nothing about this which can be related to an experience in that kind of normal way. And I mean, I know talking about out-of-body experiences isn't really what we think of as the normal way, but in another way it is.
I have read that scientists have stimulated the brain, and they stimulate one area, and then there was an outer body experience.
Yes.
It's a kind of a brain function.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've read that they're able to stimulate 3 different kinds of, let's call them non-ordinary experiences through brain stimulation. One is an out-of-body experience, one is the sense of being behind myself, and I can't remember what the third was, but absolutely, yeah, these quite clearly are brain states, yeah.
But I had out-of-body experience where what I saw, it was a few days after in the Zeitung, in the paper.
In future.
No, newspaper.
In the newspaper. So I experienced something that happens on the ocean, and two days later it was as a picture and an article in the paper. So, but this is nothing with I connect with spirituality.
No.
It's nothing with non-duality.
No.
It's nothing to do.
It'd be better if you saw the winning lottery numbers from a few days later, wouldn't it? In a way.
Yeah.
No, I mean, there are extraordinary phenomena, using that word, I hope, in its literal sense, phenomena which we would not consider necessarily ordinary and everyday, simply because they don't happen every day. It's obvious that the brain is an incredibly complex organism of which we still know very little. And it can produce the most amazing phenomena. Yeah. And if we wanted to, we could start to weave several different stories about that, because it involves time, which is very fascinating. So we could involve stories about, prophecy and seers and seeing into the future, or we could go down more the kind of non-duality route and say, well, that demonstrates what we're saying, that all time is one time and time doesn't really exist. And it's food for the mind. It's all right, it's interesting if you're interested in it. But, yeah, so what? Yeah.
Yeah.
But there's also something when you wrote about the acid trip.
What?
Trip, the LSD.
Oh, the acid trip.
Acid.
Yeah.
When too many impressions come in, overwhelming, then is that not also possible that this I kind of is swept away?
Yeah, anything's possible.
Yeah.
Anything's possible, so I have to answer yes to that. I mean, it certainly was not the case here. There was nothing about that acid trip that I would remotely associate with what we're talking about. The importance of that, of course, it had no importance whatsoever, but the importance of that acid trip to the very serious-minded young man that I was at the time, I would say, in a rather pompous way, was it revealed that reality is plastic, and it depends to some, I wouldn't have put it quite this way at the time, it depends to some extent, or perhaps totally, on what's happening in the brain. So you change what's happening in the brain very slightly, and reality completely realigns itself. It's hugely plastic. So to somebody who's just lived with this kind of one solid reality to the age of about 27 or however old I was at the time, that is quite a shock. And so that's kind of, that's what kick-started the spiritual search, because it's like, oh wow, things aren't quite the way I'd always assumed them to be. But no connection at all with seeing through the person, whatever the hell that means, no. And in a sense, the other drug experience I describe in that book, which is psilocybin experience, was like 5 hours of seeing God, really, and knowing the meaning of the universe. Please don't ask me what the hell that means, because I'll just burst into tears. I don't know. I just know for 5 hours, it's felt like seeing God and knowing the meaning of the universe. That too, I wouldn't relate in any way at all what we're talking about here. And the reason for that is because there was still someone there having what was clearly an experience. It's a very, very faint someone. There was someone who was clearly completely off their head, but nevertheless there was still someone there having that experience. And I'd make the same point about transcendence in meditation. It's lovely, transcendence in meditation. Lovely experience. But at least, from what I'm saying, there was always a slight someone, even in the most profound state of transcendence, there was a slight someone there. And it's just in a completely different ballpark to what we're talking about as, seeing, whether it's a flash or whether it's more than a flash. Because there's nothing necessarily transcendent about that. But there's nobody there, not even a trace, not even 1% of the person. So that's the distinction I make.
I remember a German Buddhist monk, a woman, Aya Kema, quite famous. She died 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And she led into meditation, and there were 8 steps or 8 levels of going deeper. And the last 2, she really claimed that you go beyond I. and gave a definition of what it is and how that is and why there's no I and so on. And she said that this is exactly what Buddha was teaching. I don't know. I mean,
well, I don't know either, and I'm not going to comment directly on that because I don't know her and I don't know what she's talking about, but I used to teach meditation, and I certainly, from my perspective then, would have said something fairly similar. I would have described transcendence as there's no I there. I would have said that. I would have said that. I did say that.
And it's not the case.
No. As far as I no, it's absolutely, not the case. I mean, transcendence is lovely, and there's various studies of brainwave patterns and so forth, which indicate that it's healthy. Why wouldn't it? I mean, very deep relaxation, blood pressure drops. The brain goes into an alpha rhythm or whatever. Why wouldn't that be healthy? Of course, lovely, wonderful. But no, I wouldn't describe that as. I would say there is nothing transcendent. Let's take the phrase unconditional love out of this, because that does sound a bit transcendent. So let's just talk about what's often described as what can just be a very, very, almost, well, maybe a split second of just the seeing of emptiness, right? I would say there is nothing transcendent about that whatsoever. It's everything goes, in transcendence, it's kind of like there is a kind of trace of experience there, even in very deep transcendence, and that experience is very different to what I'm going to say to what we're having here. Obviously, some of you might be in a deep state of transcendence at this moment, listening to my hypnotic voice. I don't know. But that split second of awakening that quite often occurs, there's nothing transcendent about it. Everything's going on exactly the same as before, it's just there isn't anybody experiencing it. And yet, its experience is still happening. So that's all I can say, and again, it doesn't matter. I mean, maybe I'm wrong about the Buddhist nun. She's talking about something different, and I don't know, it doesn't really matter. I'd say for many people, meditation is a healthy thing to do, not for everybody. Physical exercise is a healthy thing to do. I'm profoundly suspicious of all narratives of different levels of consciousness. And I'm not sure if that was kind of implied in what this nun you're talking about was saying, but there are many narratives of different levels of consciousness. I may have mentioned here before, I watched a short video of a kind of very implausible young couple in America. I suspect somewhere very remote in America. I don't know why I feel that. But they've got an organisation, and you can give them huge sums of money, and for these huge sums of money they will give you transmissions and sort of things which will allow you to enter different levels of consciousness, and I think they've got 1,000 of these. I might be wrong about this. If I am, I apologise to them sincerely. But it seems to me they talk about 1,000 levels of consciousness. I'm profoundly suspicious of any claim to levels of consciousness. But even if there are such things as levels of consciousness psychologically, they have nothing to do with what we're talking about. Clearly there are different brain states, and if we want to call those different brain states different states of consciousness, well, yeah, fine, that'll work. Clearly, dreamless sleep, we could say, is a different state of consciousness to waking.
It's what you say, that's a level is a state. A state. Don't talk about states or...
Yeah. And clearly there are these
Zapping the different channels on TV. You have different levels or states or programs. It's a little bit that, I think. Yeah, perhaps.
So we're used to thinking in terms of waking state, dreamless sleep state, and then because of a bit of advance in neuroscience, we know about the different brain rhythms. So there are alpha states and beta states and theta states and so forth. Yeah, of course. Yeah,
it's always changing.
Yeah,
changing and changing.
Everything's changing.
Oh yeah. So.
Yeah. I have so far failed to send my check to the plausible couple of Americans over their 1,000 levels of consciousness.
Sounds very fatiguing, I think.
Very well.
Fatiguing.
I'm not getting that.
Fatiguing.
Yes.
It's really fatiguing. Story of the 1,000 levels of so you have how to work and work harder and harder.
Yeah.
No, it's.
Yeah. Well, the mind loves a path, and the longer the path, the better, in a way. In the same way, the mind loves a story, and the more complicated the story, the better. Because the more complicated the story, the longer it can keep going. Yeah.
Can you say a bit about projection, and does it still kind of go on for you in a normal? That idea of, taking back the projection, the big projection of someone being in a spiritual state or someone being malevolent, or there are malevolent people obviously as well.
There are malevolent individuals, yes.
But that residual, do you think it's always the case that there's a residual projection of expecting people to be like you are somehow?
I'm not sure.
People are more or less like the way your personality operates. They're fairly benign, fairly...
Oh, that assumption.
Yeah, kind of...
I don't think there's any general rule about that, actually. I think that's a really individual thing. But going back to, projection itself, I think there is something about seeing this that does blow our projections apart. And it's a bit difficult to talk about this because, of course, it might also depend to a certain extent on psychological or psychotherapeutic work that someone's done, because that can also help to destroy projections. But I think just as there's something about seeing this which blows our conditioning apart, which can be very disturbing, by the way, of course, I think there's also something about this that blows our projections apart, so that it becomes much less likely that we will make heavy projections onto others. And I know I've talked about this before in a different context, and I don't know if it's going in a different direction, so we might want to come back on this. But for example, if we talk about the way seeing this can destabilise an individual's life, because it can in all sorts of ways. One of the ways I talked about before that this can happen is that if I and my beloved partner are devoted to a guru, let's say, and we're running satsangs in a house for the guru, and this is really in a way the glue that holds our relationship together, because we're so devoted to this path together, and we're both making the same enormous projections onto the guru. If one of us sees this and those projections are gone, it's likely to destabilise or possibly destroy that relationship because the glue's gone, and that can happen in a moment. That projection can just collapse. Conditioning and projections can absolutely be blown away by this. I'm not sure if that's kind of addressing the question as you put it.
Well, it's just my experience of going about your daily business and assuming that people are more or less like yourself.
Yeah.
And anyway, I don't...
Well, again, I'd say, that what we assume about people, again, it depends a great deal on psychological states, which probably depend a great deal again on unconscious conditioning and projections and so forth. So, for example, one individual might be going through about their daily life, assuming by and large that people are malevolent, because there's a certain degree of paranoia going on inside that person, so they'll tend to construe what we might call, let's say, innocent actions and innocent expressions and so forth. They'll tend to construe them, malevolently. So, the person who's in a kind of minor state of paranoia goes into a bar and somebody looks at them neutrally, but they think they're looking at them threateningly, right? So that's a sort of part of their psychological makeup. It's quite likely that, again, that might just be blown apart if this is seen, because anything kind of to do with psychological conditioning and psychological way of being could just be blown apart. So it's quite possible, it's quite likely then, that that individual might no longer misconstrue what's happening out there because of their own projections. Has that got anything at all to do with what you're asking?
Maybe, yeah.
Yeah, maybe.
Sort of,
yeah. Yeah. So the kind of projections that, like, in a way might be most relevant in terms of to what we're talking about and have been talking about, you think of the kind of projections that are put onto the guru figure, for example. So that's the positive projection. And again, that's likely to kind of be, it's like, well, everything's the same. So that tendency in me to put somebody else on a pedestal is likely to collapse. I don't know whether that means that the worst thing that can happen to the guru is that their devotees wake up. Of course, the other thing is that one of the dangers that the guru runs is that a projection is a projection is a projection, and the most powerful positive projection can very easily reverse and turn into the most powerful negative projection. I used to, professionally, I was a college lecturer, and I had a colleague who once said something very perceptive to me. I knew this chap for about 20 years, and he only once said something perceptive to me, but it was perceptive enough to remember. And he said, Richard, the trouble with students is they're always at your throat or at your feet. Now that is the clearest possible statement of projection, how projection works. And one of the problems of that is that the one can turn into the other very quickly. So, the student can be, at your feet, but that means your feet are at eye level, and when your feet are at eye level, that is the most likely place at which the student may suddenly see that the feet are made of clay, at which point they knock you off the pedestal, and then they're at your throat. And it seems to me that equally goes for gurus, spiritual teachers, and any other kind of projection that might be placed onto an authority figure. Again, I've no idea if that addresses what you're saying.
Well, I was also thinking, I suppose, of the spiritual teachers who are malevolent in a sense.
Yeah.
And that is can be beyond projection, so you may not, because it's not it's not acted out. You may be in touch with malevolent drives in yourself, but it could be, I can see how it'd be very, very hard to see that, and yet...
Very hard to see.
To see malevolence
in the spiritual teacher,
because it's beyond the projection. Yeah, in the spiritual teacher, and there's going to be quite a lot of them.
Yeah. So I was talking about our tendency to project something which is in us onto the other, whether that's seeing them as so much wiser than we are, or smashing them down and seeing them as so much less than us. But of course, there's also that the actual whoever, but let's take the spiritual teacher or the guru, absolutely. Of course they may genuinely be malevolent. Yeah. I mean, I'm using that word because you're using it. It's not the natural word for me to use, but they might, you know, I mean, here's a question, I'm not quite sure of the answer to it, but I kind of suspect that I might be drawn to a certain answer to it. You know, is the spiritual teacher more likely to be suffering from a personality disorder than the average person in the street? And my tendency is to say, well, on average, maybe yes, because, you know, a personality disorder is quite likely to make us feel special and different and to behave in that way, and that special and different way is likely to then attract positive projections, and so we get followers. And I was referring earlier to this video, this documentary Holy Hell, about the ballet dancing guru in America. I have absolutely no doubt that he has a personality disorder. And I suspect that if you watch that video, you will probably come to the same conclusion.
And the fearlessness.
And the fearlessness, that's a good one.
Narcissistic.
No, thank you for reminding me of that, because as far as I know, I'm by no means an expert in this field, but as I understand it, both sociopaths and narcissists, or some narcissists, and maybe sociopaths in general, there is this tendency not to experience fear. Oh my God, the power that that confers! So, I mean, I'm not sitting here and saying that in general gurus or spiritual teachers are narcissists or psychopaths. I'm not saying that, but I do seem to be suggesting that perhaps they might be more highly, sociopaths and narcissists might be more highly represented amongst gurus and spiritual teachers than in the population in general, just as we know, I think research tells us, that they're more highly represented in, you know, the higher management and the, you know, the bosses of multinational corporations. So I don't know if there are 5%, if 5% of the population are sociopaths, you'd expect maybe 20% of the bosses of multinational corporations to be sociopaths, because sociopathic personality certainly helps you rise, you know, to the top of the heap in competitive.
There's just Richard Grannon said they were overrepresented in psychotherapists.
I find that very interesting.
Which is interesting, yeah.
Do you know why he says that?
Because it's power, position of power which you can exploit.
I'm making no comment on that, you know, I mean, Richard Grannon knows more about this stuff than I do, but I'm certainly not an expert, but it's just like common sense, it seems to me, says, well, yeah, if you want to look for occupations, let me call it that, where sociopaths and narcissists are more highly represented on the street than the average, you wouldn't look for bus drivers, but you would look for the heads of multinational companies, and you might look at gurus and spiritual teachers. I think that's what I find so delightful about that other documentary that I recommended, that Kumari, because there it seems to me you have somebody who's most definitely not suffering from a personality disorder, who is setting out deliberately to try to bust these projections, you know, and doing it in a, you know, I think in a very effective way as well. So we have another take perhaps on the fearlessness of the guru. You know, maybe the guru is fearless not because he is enlightened, but because he's a psychopath. Possibly. Has everybody in here heard the story of the guru's son and the dead donkey? I know I've told it many times. I can't remember if I've ever told it over here. I
don't think so.
If you'll indulge me, because I think it does have relevance to what we were talking about before, about projections and so on. So, I came across this, it was a kind of Mullah Nasruddin story. It doesn't really make sense to me culturally in that way. So let's just make it a guru's son, right? So there's a guru who's very successful, has this huge ashram, but he has a son, and his son is, as we say in English, a bit of a waste of space. You know, he's a sort of he's no good at anything, and eventually his father gets so fed up with him, he throws him out of the ashram, and all he's got is a few old clothes in a bundle, and his donkey is a very old donkey. And so he just has to leave and make his own life, and so he walks off, and he's travelling for a few days along this dusty road, and then one morning he's walking along, and to make matters even worse, the donkey suddenly falls over and dies. And he's so kind of beaten down and broken down by this, the Guru's son, that he just sits down by the donkey with his head in his hands like that, and like, what could happen? What worse could happen? And he just sits there. And eventually some travellers come along and they see this, and they say, look at this poor man, his donkey's died. And he's so upset, he loved the animal so much, he's so upset, he's too heartbroken even to bury it. Let's bury it for him. So they dig a hole, they bury the donkey, then they pile the earth back over it, so there's now a mound, and the Guru's son just sits there watching it, he doesn't say anything, and the men go off, and eventually some more travellers come by, and they say, look at this poor man sitting here, you know, there's a burial mound there, he looks so sad, obviously his friend has died. And he's so sad, he's been able to bury him, but he hasn't got the heart or the strength to build a little, you know, let's put a little pile of stones on the mound as a memorial to his friend. So they do this, and the Guru's son just sort of looks on, doesn't say anything. Some more travellers come along, and they say, look at this man sitting by the road. Somebody has built, you know, he must be a wise man. Look, he has followers who have built this little shrine to him. You know, with stones and so forth. Let us sit down here and absorb his wisdom. He doesn't speak, he must be one of these teachers who teaches silently through his wisdom. So they sit down, eventually some more people say, look at this man, see, he's got followers, and let us sit and absorb his, you know, and it goes on, and eventually more and more people come by and stop, and then they have to go off at night back to their homes and come back, and they say, why don't we build a little ashram for this great holy teacher who teaches silently, because the Guru's son just goes on sitting there and says nothing. And so they build a little temple for him, and then they build a little dormitory block, and then more and more people come, and you get the drift, you know. So over a period of time, more and more people come, they have to build more and more dormitories and a bigger and bigger meditation hall and so forth. And stories of this great guru who never says anything but just teaches, you know, teaches silently, shares his wisdom silently, and begin to spread, and more people come. And eventually the fame of this teacher spreads so far as it gets back to his own father in his ashram, and his father thinks, gosh, I must go and see this great teacher. You know, people that seem so impressed by him. So the father sets out, and he travels, and he goes to the ashram, and he can just see this tiny little guru figure now sitting on a stage with this huge mass of people sort of adoring him as he sits there in silence. And so he sort of fights his way through the crowd to get close enough to touch the holy feet, and he sort of gets onto the stage, he looks at it, my God, it's my son, and he can't believe it. So he goes up to him, and he sits next to him, and, you know, says, son, and the Guru, Dad, you know, how nice to see you, you know. And the Guru said, well, what happened? You know, how did this happen? How did you become this great teacher? And so his son tells him everything that happened, you know, starting off with the dead donkey, and his father's listening to this. He said, at the end, he says, this is actually, you know, he says to his son, yeah, that's absolutely amazing. He said, do you know what? Exactly the same thing happened for me. So So in case we didn't spot it, that is definitely a story about projection.